Hello out there! Welcome to another Tuesday AutoCrit Live. I am so excited to join you this week. We are going to talk about, as it says on the header, line editing demystified. And maybe you clicked on it and you're like, I don't even know what line editing is or what's going on. Well, we are going to talk about that. So if you're not sure, don't worry. We're going to go through it. We are going to demystify it. I was thinking about starting our whole thing with like a bunch of mist, but I decided that was a little gimmicky, so I spared you. We have people watching or listening from all over, so a little shout out: Hawaii, South Carolina, Chicago, Florida, England, Mars. Thank you. Yes, we have somebody visiting on Mars usually. Uh, Michigan, Canada, Nevada, Texas, Portland. Yeah, and lots of people are warm. Well, hopefully, I don't know. Shouldn't cool you off. It should. We'll say it will direct that heat towards your writing, so you'll be fired up not only in temperature but in your writing passion. How about that? I need a fog machine. Life is always better with a fog machine. So I am all for it. For sure. All right. So let's get started going into line editing. One of the biggest questions we get is, what is the difference between line editing and developmental editing? Question. I'm like, well, let's see if the audience can answer now. This is a quiz for you too. Now, when a lot of people talk about editing, they like to break it up into different processes because, well, let's be honest, editing is a grueling thing to do. You have this big hunk of something and you're trying to carve it out. It's like that old joke, how do you carve an elephant out of marble? You carve everything that doesn't look like an elephant. The same kind of thing, right? You're carving everything in your manuscript that doesn't resemble a story, that doesn't add to the story, things like that. So in order to break it down into processes, a common way of putting it is developmental versus line editing. And the developmental editing process is when you are dealing with the bones, the structure. Does the story work? Does the pacing work? Are people interested in your characters? Does it make logical sense? Things like that. And then the line editing is a little bit more of the mechanical side. It's more of, do the sentences make sense? Is this the best way to write this story? Which is a little bit different than, is this story fundamentally flawed in the first place? Do we need to make major changes? Now, the important thing to realize is we recommend, well, really anybody recommends, that you make sure your developmental editing is tight, is put together before you even tackle line editing. Why? Well, you could have a really beautifully written chapter and then you decide there's no reason for this chapter to even exist anymore because I've decided the story's going to go a completely different direction. So you can spend all of this effort polishing and making this beautiful masterpiece that just goes away. And maybe you could save it, you could put it in a trunk, maybe it might come up later in another novel or something like that. But more than likely you can't just lift it and put it in another one, right? Even if there's elements of it. So you're spending a lot of time polishing something that may in fact not exist. It's like polishing your car and then turns out you actually want to buy a different car instead. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. So we recommend first tackling developmental editing. And that's not the purpose of this broadcast, but just to let you know what we mean by developmental editing, we're talking about things like the plot, that story structure. And if you want to know more about plot, we're going to get into plot in a couple months. September is going to be all about plot. So for those of you who are plotters or planners or aren't, it'll be lots of fun, especially if you aren't, because you're going to learn a lot. It'll be great. The other thing about developmental editing is the conflict, right? What is that central conflict of your story? Not just the kind of things that happen, but what's that driving force underneath the whole thing, right? And then of course you want to make sure your characters are strong. Do we care about them? Do they have motivation? Are they not just doing things because you kind of told them to, as the big robotic, as the big God game master, right? Or are they acting realistic in a way that we can track? And then, of course, there's just the logistics of your story. And these are things like, did you remember how far this location was from this location to where it makes sense? Did you track this object from this scene to this scene? Those sort of plot holes that can really hurt you. So yeah, so developmental edit, take care of that first. Make sure you get all of this under your thumb. Make sure you get all of this all buttoned up, and then you are ready for line editing. You have fired up. I've submitted 2 short stories in the last 2 weeks. Great job. Yeah, you got to submit stuff out there. You submit, you get rejected, you submit again, you dust yourself off. That is the process. Yes, developmental equals kill darlings. Line equals come to terms with the fact you use too many adverbs. It is true. Although I will say you can end up with darlings even on the line editing level. But a darling is, if you don't know that term, it's something you become very attached to, but isn't adding to your story. So you really should get rid of it. That's why it's a darling. It's something you don't want to get rid of, but you should for the sake of your story. And sometimes you have to. Um, Developmental story arc, line editing equals structure. Yeah, you got it. All right. So I'm resurrecting a darling from one book to a starting scene from another. Does this make me a word necromancer? It kind of does. And that's the fun thing. And that's the fun thing about the trunk novel concept or the parking lot. I have a document sometimes that I call my parking lot, because what I'll do is I'll be like, ugh, this is awful, and then I'll dump it over there, and then eventually in one of my developmental edit passes I'll go back in the parking lot, and sometimes I decide, you know what, I was really harsh, that needs to go back in, and I put it back in. So you can go the other way. I don't know what the opposite of a darling is. I guess a I don't know, like a unwanted, an unwanted wanderer or something. Uh, but that is that can happen, and then you can realize you want it back. So that's part of the developmental editing, is looking for sensory details in developmental line editing. I would say that's more of a line editing thing. Yes, not so much the developmental editing. So those are 2 things you kind of mush together. Sensory details tends to be in the way you are delivering the story versus what your story is, which is more of a developmental editing. Yes, I like the parking lot because that sounds way less severe. And sometimes when you have to give away stuff, you're like, I don't want to get rid of it. I don't know if you're like, oh, it's just going to the parking lot. It's not so bad. It's like it'll come back. It'll come back. Never was able to send a finished novel because you kept editing, editing, editing. Yes, we recommend processes. If you have not checked out our After the Draft series that we did last December, I recommend checking that out because it is a great overview of how to step by step deal with a manuscript after your first draft. And the important thing with editing is to have a process, because then you have an end. Because the truth of the matter is there is no end to editing. You can always do better. I mean, look at George Lucas. He's re-edited Star Wars how many times now? Like you can you can keep redoing it. There's really no reason why you would want to stop. Because you might say, "Oh, this could be better. This could be better." So at a certain point, you have to. So having a process can mean that you have that artificial cutoff where it's like, and this is it. And at that point, yeah, I've gone through it. I've done the processes, and then it's done. So it can be really helpful. I had 6 darlings in chapter 1. The demon killed them 5 pages later. Sounds like horror. Tolkien spent 12 years on the Fellowship. It is true. Just because you spend a long time on a book does not mean you're a bad author by any stretch of the imagination. Some authors only work on a single work for a very long period of time. Generally speaking, we don't recommend that process because practice does tend to make perfect. And rather than constantly perfecting the same thing, we recommend trying different things. But, you know, you do you. Everybody's career is different. Okay, so that being said, the first thing you want to do is after your developmental edit is let it rest. Ah, do nothing. Well, you don't have to do nothing, but do nothing with that manuscript at that point. After you finish your developmental edit, you are thinking mechanically about the story structure, and you've really gotten into the weeds and to the point where you might be kind of about the whole story because you're just micromanaging the whole thing. So if you go in with a line editing eye after that, you're going to be like, hack, hack, hack. This is awful. This is awful. And it's just going to throw you off. Or you won't be looking at it with the fresh sort of eyes you need to, right? So what we recommend is you take a step back. Now, it's going to vary the process from person to person. This is why it can be helpful to have multiple projects going on at once. Maybe you're kind of developing one, you're thinking about it, you're just brainstorming, you're just spending the day and you're not even like writing, but you're just thinking about writing, you're thinking about your next project, you write some ideas. This is a good time to do that sort of stuff because then when you come back to your manuscript, well, now it looks fresher. It might even look kind of brand new. It just depends on how your mind works. Sometimes if you get yourself wrapped up in a new project, you can forget a lot about the one you just worked on. Again, depending on how your mind works, to the point where it almost feels like kind of a new book written by an author. I mean, you might know what happened, but it won't feel quite as familiar. And that's helpful because you need those fresh eyes in order to edit yourself the best. As we all know, somebody who's not you tends to do a great job of finding things that you can't. So you're trying to simulate that experience as much as possible. Okay. So that being said, some easy fixes that can immediately make your work pop and it might be an easy win to start out with are things like filler words and adverbs. Now, filler words, these are things like just, that, very, etc. If you're an AutoCrit member, you can go through in AutoCrit and you can bring up the filler words report, and it gives you a whole nice list of all your filler words. And the nice thing about that is it even tells you which ones you tend to overuse versus the average person, which is really helpful because you might use that 800 times in your book, and that might be actually fairly normal for a book of that length. It just depends. On the other hand, you might use it and it's bloated in comparison. So then you realize, oh, that's my verbal tick. It is common for people to have a verbal tick. I mean, talking, of course, but when they write. And often it's a filler word that comes up a lot. Just, that, and very are probably the most common for that kind of thing, where you just put it in and it really doesn't serve any purpose. And those types of words, they really are bloat. They're filler. They don't really do much besides maybe give you some rhythm, maybe sometimes emphasis. You don't always have to get rid of them. But often, if you can get rid of them and they don't change the meaning of the sentence, yeah, easy win because it slows down the pace to keep those in. I recently had to come to terms with my use of the word even. Yeah. I mean, it'll happen. As soon as you catch this, the nice thing is this is something that becomes easier the more you write. Because even though we don't recommend, really, you shouldn't, going too critical with your first draft because you're going to lose your mind if you try to make it too clean. On the other hand, it being in the back of your head, it's like, oh, I tend to use that a lot. You'll start to write it less and less. You'll just notice it. The other thing, of course, are adverbs. Now, if you missed it last week, we did a whole long thing about adverbs, and we went into why you can use them, when you shouldn't use them, how they can get annoying. We read a lot of cringy sentences. So if you didn't check that out, check out last week's episode about adverbs. It was lots of fun and maybe only a little bit painful. But those are some easy fixes to help you out and just clean up your sentences. Okay, the next thing is one thing you want to look out is your order of information. This is a line editing thing, right? This is something you need to look at for your story too, but we're assuming you did that already, right? The order of information in terms of scenes makes sense. But even that being said, within the scene, within the paragraph, the order of information can make a dramatic difference. Okay. So, for the example, you could start a scene where from the get-go we understand that there is a monster in the room, and where is the monster? They could look this way, they could look that way, they could look that the other way. And by setting that up from the start, well, you're tense reading about all those descriptions. It's like, there's a couch and there's a chair or whatever, and you understand that the person is looking at them in order to determine if there's a monster hiding behind them. On the flip side, you could do the opposite, right? You could have somebody and they're describing the scene in a room and it seems very quaint, and all of a sudden a monster jumps out, right? This is a choice. This is a choice you have when you're line editing. And this is an obvious example. But the same sort of rhythm can be applied to anything. It's a bit like the monster at the end of this book. Yes, great story. Check it out if you haven't. You can find people reading it on YouTube. It's great. Got a great plot twist too. Anyway, but this sort of thing isn't just applicable to scary scenes. This is really applicable to anything. The most important piece of information you get to decide when the audience knows about it in terms of that punch, right? Do you want to punch them at the beginning or punch them at the end? And often punching them at the end is a great strategy because it kind of keeps them on their toes. If they're always ending those if they're, well, not always, but if they're often ending those paragraphs with a and the it really can make a big difference in your work. So one thing to look at, if you find a paragraph is just kind of meh, like it's just kind of sitting there and you need to get all the information out and you can't really tell if there's anything like broken about it, try changing the order that you're learning about things. Just try messing with the order of the sentences. The context of the sentences next to each other can make a really big difference. So look at that. That is a sort of meticulous thing to do, but it can certainly be helpful, again, especially if it's a problematic paragraph. You don't necessarily have to do it every single time. That might might take you forever if you did that. Aim for specificity in your words, right? Specific language is more interesting to read than vague language is a lot of the time. Now, that doesn't mean that we always have to use the most specific words in all cases, because that would get pedantic, really, or what do you want to say, like overly descriptive or long-winded. No, but we should use words that are specific when we can, because that actually can do the opposite of what I just said in terms of overdoing it. If you do it correctly, you're actually going to save time, because instead of saying, the dress was pretty and you just keep going on it, if you say something more specific about the dress was impeccable. Well, that immediately draws us closer to the concept of what it is you're trying to describe, what a garment like that looks like. Somebody said, but it isn't like adverbs are always bad, right? No, of course not, which is why check out last week. There are a lot of good reasons to use adverbs, despite what Stephen King says. And Stephen King uses them too, which you'll find out in the last episode. So check it out. But specific language can be helpful. Now, if you have AutoCrit membership, you can check out the generic words report. Generic descriptions report, and it will call out a lot of these words. This is kind of hard to do it yourself, but something to just look at. So if you see something and it's like it's pretty, it's big, it's good, these are sort of words that don't give us a lot of information. You can go more particular and more specific. Recommend a thesaurus. Yes. Be careful though with with a thesaurus, because you don't want to use a word incorrectly. Because one great thing about using a thesaurus is you can get to a more specific word. But the way a thesaurus is used correctly is when you're trying to say something like, well, it's big. And you're like, well, big is not that exact. And then you pull up the thesaurus and it says, it's gargantuan. You're like, oh, yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind. If you know the word, if you're used to the context it's generally used, then you are going to get that specific meaning. If you're just reaching for it because you're like, well, I've used big a bunch of times, you might not. In fact, you might be misleading your audience into a different meaning that you didn't intend, or you might use the word improperly and look like you just reached for a thesaurus, which is not the best thing to do. This is true. When writing from a child's point of view, the language needs to be more basic and generic. It is true. You are going to be limited in your vocabulary when it comes to certain audiences. However, that doesn't mean you can't be specific in certain ways. Uh, for example, if you were writing a story about uh, a child and you were writing about the building they resided in, well, you could choose to just say, their house, but you might say it's a mansion, right? And most children know what that word means. Or you might say it's a apartment or something like that. And you're like, that's not much of a specific language, but it is better than just landing on house, if that makes sense. Just twisting it even a little bit, getting a little bit deeper can make the difference. You don't necessarily have to reach for an SAT word in order to get to specificity. Even just the difference between saying the character was eating fruit versus they were eating an orange can make a difference, because it just conjures up a clear image. Condominium might be a little bit over a child's head, depends on the child. All right. Stop repeating yourself. Yeah, stop repeating yourself. It's really annoying when people repeat the same thing over and over again, because you kind of get the idea the first time to the point where they don't have to keep repeating a statement. It gets annoying and okay, you can see what I'm doing. But we repeat ourselves in many ways as authors. One way we do is with exact repetition. This is when we use the exact same word. It was kind of getting back to what I was saying just a moment ago about specificity. If you're constantly just saying big, 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 big all the time, well, it's not very specific. A common word is look. If you just say they look there, they look there, they look there, that's really repetitive. Where instead you could say they glanced, they stared, they glowered, whatever. That can be really helpful. But beyond just that kind of repetition, specifically, is that a lion's mane jelly on Daniel's shirt? I think it is. I actually made this shirt myself with the use of artificial intelligence graphic design. I know, I'm a nerd. Anyway, um, stop repeating yourself. See, now I'm gonna get stuck repeating myself. Oh yes. So, so the important thing with repeating yourself is that you can use exact repetition, which is when you repeat the same word over and over again, right? Or the exact same phrase. Sometimes you do that comedically, you killed my father, prepare to die, sort of thing. It could be a catchphrase. But beyond that, what is maybe even more common, because that tends to be something we'll catch. Although if you have AutoCrit, it's helpful because you can run those repetition reports. But if you, but a thing that happens more often, in my opinion, is repetition of concept, and this is when we repeat the same information over and over again. Now, there are a couple of reasons why you might want to do that. You might want to repeat the same information over and over again because you're doing something like a parallelism, right? Like you're saying, the man looked over here, and then he looked over here, and then he looked over here, and then he looked over here. And that's kind of effective. It just keeps building, right? And you can create suspense and tension that way. So that can be helpful. The other thing too is you might repeat yourself in terms of the concept when you want to get across emphasis, because it's very important. So you repeat it in order that people understand it. Okay, I'll stop. But when you say something, when you give that information again, it makes it really cement in the mind. Now, often you don't do it right back to back like I just did, because that's kind of obvious. But this is the sort of thing where you might have an important object in your story, and it has some sort of characteristic that's going to play into the plot later. Maybe it's one of those mystery stories where there's that secret cabinet that always exists in those stories, and there's like some secret way to unlock it through some secret key and some weird object. And so you're just constantly mentioning, it's like, the the ring had a very peculiar filigree that looked like a deer, and then later it's like the peculiar filigree that looks like a deer, and then later it's like, oh wait, I have this deer filigree, it's going to open up Uncle Bob's secret locker, and then you open up. Excuse me. So yes, that can be helpful, because if you don't repeat that detail, they might just look over it the first time. However, another reason you might want to do it is because what you're talking about is kind of complicated. Maybe it is a certain amount of exposition that is not very clear. It's an emotional state that is not quite understandable unless you kind of approach it from a bunch of different directions. It can be helpful. But what you want to avoid, this is a long opening to get to this point. What you want to avoid is when you are just treading water. It's like, we get it. We understand. The man is depressed. I get it. He's depressed. I get it. He's depressed. It can become so frustrating when that happens, because you aren't going anywhere. You're just treading water. You're just, and the story's not going anywhere, and you're just wasting time. So there is a balance there. There's a certain amount of repetition you need for emphasis, but for the most part, what you want to do is always move forward. You don't want to tread water or stop. You don't want to just keep the audience hovering in a single spot. And that gets us to dramatizing, don't summarize, which is the way around AutoCrit that we like to say the old catchphrase, show, don't tell. I think this is a lot better. That's my personal perception. Because what you want to do a lot of the time is be dramatic, because after all, we're reading a book, not a Wikipedia synopsis, right? So you want to be dramatic. You want to show the audience what is going on. Now, to my last point, what often happens, and this happens to the most seasoned of writers, is that you will show and then tell, or you will dramatize and then summarize, or vice versa. And that's because you're scared that the audience is not going to get it. Which, like I said, for some complicated concepts might be important. It might be that you want to describe a quite complex emotion by summarizing it and then dramatizing it to show what kind of effect it has. However, if you just showed the effect, it might not let the audience quite know the emotional state, if you understand what I mean. So that's a situation where it makes sense. But a lot of the time, you don't have to actually do that. If you dramatize it well, you don't need to summarize. The audience could summarize it for you. And by summarizing it, you are just wasting their time. In fact, you might be annoying them because it's like, did you get it? Did you get it? And it's like, yes, I got it. And it also slows things down. So this is a really easy thing to pick up. You'll notice you'll do it a fair amount. Somebody says that their beta readers are often asking what is going on. It might be that you need to recruit clever readers, but it might be that, in fact, you are not summarizing enough, or you need to pick a different method on how you're dramatizing things. And I wouldn't be able to go deeper than that without specifics about the type of story it is, because it's like asking what is going on in terms of what. That could be more of a plot level issue, right? The structure, the order of information, the complexity of the puzzle the audience is on, or whatever it is, and all of that. But I wouldn't necessarily discount if you get a lot of feedback that people are confused, because unless you have a bunch of outliers, confusion is something that that's one of the best things to use a beta reading group for, because they might subjectively hate a character, and that's like neither here nor there, because the other audience will love the character. But confusion is something that tends to be more common, so I would be a little bit cautious about that. um so tell also, again, not necessarily, and I would say most of the time don't. Most of the time, try to stick to either dramatizing or summarizing, and not doing both. Both really is for those things that you think are going to be too complicated for the audience to understand, or that you really want to emphasize. But remember, if everything is really emphasized, then nothing is emphasized. Everything is equally important, and then you just have static. There's no dynamics, and that's not what you want. You want an up and down. You want a lot of attention, less attention. You want to change it up. Harry says that it's because the 1970s setting is unusual. Okay, so that's interesting. If you're talking about historical fiction, and they're stepping over themselves because of that, well, then yes, you will have to ask yourself who your audience is. Is this a group of people? Is your audience people that just want to get immersed in the setting, and they'll have to cope with certain things being different in the 1970s than now, and they may not think of it? Or do you want to hold the hand a little bit more because you want it to be a wider audience? And that's up to you, because I've seen historical fiction written either way. I've seen it written where it's very handholdy, and it's like, I get it. It's like, for me, who likes history, it could be a little condescending, but for somebody else, it's welcoming. It helps them out because they don't have that level of knowledge coming in. If they can be bribed by a Happy Meal, you are aiming too low for your novel readers. I don't know. Food is a really good bribe, even for me now. So I don't know what that says. I don't know quite about a Happy Meal, but yeah, exactly, Cassie. I can always be bribed with food. I'm just saying, like, food, that's like a basic human need. I don't know about, let's get too judgy about food. What about location descriptions? This is a very good point, right? This is where you have the option of dramatizing and summarizing, and often you do a bit of both, right? You might be like, It was a dark cave," and then you start to describe it in more rich detail. Or you just get flung into action and then you realize, well, it's a dark cave because somebody trips over a stalactite or something. And again, that kind of depends on a few things, like how important the location is, how interesting the location is, because it is kind of silly if somebody trips over a stalactite and then the next sentence is, "After all, it was a dark cave." You're like, okay, I get it, so you don't really have to repeat that for sure. So you got to be careful. The 70s is not historical. I'm insulted. I'm sorry. If it's any consolation, I feel so old when I talk to people about entertainment and stuff from different eras. Um, I used to work at this restaurant and they would show clips from old movies from the 1950s, these old B movies. And at one time, and I used to joke around with the kids. I'm like, "Oh, you love this movie, don't you?" Because a lot of them had never seen it. And one of the kids was like, "Yeah, I haven't seen old movies like The Lion King." And I'm like, "The Lion King came out in 1994. Wow." So yeah, that was like a total own. I cried myself to sleep that night. I'm just kidding. One thing to keep in mind with your line editing is to stay active, right? We want to keep sentences active. Now, this doesn't mean there's no use to passive sentences. We've talked about the passive voice a lot of time. It's kind of a dead horse. I don't want to like beat it to death, but staying active can help. If you find yourself kind of look at the way that your sentences are structured. Do you have a lot of "it was this and it was that and it was this and it was that," because it sometimes it could be where you're constantly talking about what is being acted upon rather than what is doing the action. And if you do that over and over again, it's kind of boring because we want to be in the place of the thing doing the action a lot of the time. That's more interesting, right? The subject being the person performing the action or the object performing the action versus the thing that the action's being done to is very, that is more where we want to be the majority of the time when we're reading because it's just more interesting. Let's be honest. All right. So moving on. Be consistent. Yes, line editing is about consistency of style as within a certain amount of reason. Now, to a certain extent, you can't help this, right? We all have a voice, we all have a style, we have a way of putting things. However, you'll find yourself kind of drifting in at times different ways. This is why a lot of writers try to be very careful with their diet while they are writing. And I don't mean their food diet, I mean like their media diet because it will affect how you write. And this can be a really helpful tool. For example, if you are writing a book and you're like, wow, I've always admired how, I don't know, Patrick Rothfuss writes his sentences, right? You might read the work and then you'll be influenced and you'll start to write more like that. On the other hand, if you're constantly flipping your influences throughout your work, well, that might mean that your work will start to sound like it's written by different people and it'll have a different flow and it will get choppy and it could harm it. But it is something to look at no matter what. Even if you're keeping a strict diet, you do want to look at the consistency of your language. And again, this is where, like the AutoCrit software is very helpful because it can show you that rhythm of your sentences. So you can see if there's an area where you're getting really weirdly off one way or the other. It's super helpful. This is something though to look at yourself, like white space on a page, right? Do you have areas that are like super white spacey and then others that are super dense? And is there a dramatic reason for that, or did you just forget that you like to have paragraph breaks, right? Do you have a lot of long sentences in a row for no apparent reason, and that's not usually how you write? Well, that's going to draw attention to itself. Is there a dramatic reason? Is this because we're stopping and really getting the audience focused on something, or is this you just wrote a long sentence, right? And I'm not saying not to have variety. I'm just saying keep in mind that those things stand out, right? It's essentially a tool you can use. Um, but if you don't have kind of a status quo that's pretty consistent, well, then you're just going to be all over the place, and it'll be like you can't find your footing. You don't know what's going to happen. One sentence is like this, and one sentence is like this, and and it's just all over the place. Now, generally speaking, I don't think that dramatic of a outcome is that likely. Like I said, we all have our styles and whatnot, but it is helpful to kind of turn up your style a little bit to get a little bit in. What you think you do well, the way that you write, if there's a scene you write and then you sit back when you're finished reading it, and occasionally we have our moments, we often tend to be harsh on ourselves, but we'll have our moments when we read a page or something, we're like, wow, I actually can do this. Take a moment and look at it a bit and see if you're doing things differently on that page than some other pages. It could be there's a mechanical difference. Maybe there's a word choice difference, and that could really help. And if you got that consistency across, well, then you might have that kind of, oh, yeah, this is a good writer across your whole book. So it's helpful. Let's see. What is with plural protagonists with different POVs, and at the end they kind of merge to an omnipresent narrator? Is that also a sign of inconsistency? This is more like a dramatic style that is promised to the audience. And I would say do have to be careful when you break that. If you have a story and it's all in first person, and then all of a sudden you have a chapter in third person, that can seem gimmicky, or it's such a break in the style that the audience can be kind of ripped out, and that's not the best. But it can be effective. I can't say never do it, but I will say be careful when you do it. You do generally want to be consistent. If you've decided to be first person, be first person. If you've decided to be present, be present. If you decided to be third person, etc. I think in general, consistency is helpful. And being said, looking for overwrought imagery. This kind of goes with that consistency, right? uh, Occasionally we'll just fall in love, and this can be a darling, with some beautiful metaphor, some beautiful description, and we'll just go on and on, or we just love this location. We just want to go on and on and on about it. And again, if that's not consistent, if that's not consistently how you're doing things, well, it's going to really stand out, and it's going to come across like purple prose. And if you don't know what purple prose is, well, you can check out my video on it. It's on this channel, purple prose. It's really good. Just saying. Um, Maybe if I say purple prose enough, the YouTube will automatically recommend it at the end. But anyway, purple prose. But purple prose is when you are trying to look very elegant. That's based on the idea that people use the word purple to show off their wealth. And so when you write something and the audience use it as purple, it's like, wow, they're really showing off the fact that they think there's some highfalutin writer. And again, getting back to consistency, if you typically write in a quite artistic way, and it's quite stylized, and it's there's a poetry to it all the time, then no, I mean, that's not going to stand out. That's just your style, right? But if you only if you write in more of a quick style, more like an airport thriller novel, and all of a sudden you have this long section where it just gets very soft and flowery and everything. You're like, oh, wait a minute, where did this person come from, right? It can be a major problem, and it can just feel overwrought. This does happen with emotion a lot, in my opinion, because the way that people will write emotion is a lot more overwrought than the way they write other things. And you might be thinking, well, of course you're going to use more emotionally charged words when writing about emotion than other things. And that's not specifically what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the way you do it, right? There's a very big difference between describing the action and letting the audience kind of infer that, to just going so poetic with it. It's like the world was coming to an end, and blah blah blah. And meanwhile, they reach like the most beautiful waterfall they've ever seen, and they're like, it was the most beautiful waterfall they ever saw. And it's like, it doesn't fit, right? You would think, if this is a near spiritual experience to see this waterfall, well, this should hit us in the same way that when the person is betrayed by the one they love, right? It should have the same sort of impact. And so what can happen is that one moment can just go, and then you just feel like, wow, this author just really went over the top. So this is something to look at with your line editing. And one place that it comes up a lot are in metaphors. Metaphors are a wonderful way to make things interesting, but they can be overwrought in a hurry, because they can either be just too complicated or clever for no reason, or they can pile on each other, kind of like adverbs, and it's just thing after thing after thing. And no. Changing from third person to first person is a major effort in getting consistency of voice. It is true. If you are somebody that typically writes one or the other, you will find switching to the other is a challenge, probably more than you think, for sure. Ooh, we have some people requesting some beta readers and setting up a thing on Facebook. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And don't forget in the AutoCrit, we do have the Facebook group for AutoCrit, so feel free to go on there and exchange information for that. But don't forget, our community, community.autocrit.com that you have, and we have places there to find each other. And we are going to be doing more of that in the future. Shh, maybe I wasn't supposed to admit that, but we have some more coming in that way. So if you like getting feedback from each other and accountability, just stay tuned. Just stay tuned. Good things are coming. All right, moving on. Read for the flow of action. Yes, this is very helpful to do when you're line editing. Sometimes we forget that to some degree, we are playing a little bit of movie director, right? We are directing what is going on in a scene. And sometimes we simply forget that we're not letting the audience know where people are. And that's helpful. So they just kind of pop up and things like that. And the other thing too is, does it flow nicely as a paragraph? Does it seem like it's a good rhythm? It's like this and then this and then this and then this and then this. Because you can really throw that off. Now again, you can do that intentionally, right? It's like the old joke. It's like, and all of a sudden, whoa, that jumped out. But if you do that all the time, then you just look like you're crazy. You're just like doing the spastic dance. You look like you don't know what you're doing. What you generally want is a pretty regular rhythm, and then it's like, okay, and maybe it gets faster and then slower, but it's a pretty steady pace. And this can be with both the rhythm of the sentences, the length of the sentences, but also that order of information. Again, kind of like what I said earlier, the flow of the information is helpful. Does one thing kind of uh, ask for the next one? Do they nest into each other well? This is something to look at when you are line editing. Can make a really big difference. All right, so those were some tips on line editing demystified, but there is a lot more, obviously, on this topic. So, we are, in fact, offering up a self editing workshop in a little while. It's actually going to be next Thursday and Sunday. Um, Next being August 4th, just just to be specific in my language, because people use that phrase differently sometimes. August 4th and August 7th. So it'll be two 90-minute sessions where I'm going to go through some of the things that I talked about today and a lot more in a lot more detail with exercises and all that kind of fun stuff. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And I will drop in a link to sign up in the comments or in the description below. So you can join us for that if you would like to. Now, one thing I would like to say before I wrap things up today is next month we do have an exciting new challenge that I'm so excited about. Change the world. We all would love to change the world, right? Well, we do get to. That's the fun thing about writing. So, Change the World is a completely new challenge for you. And this one is not going to be demanding on you in terms of a word count, but it will be demanding on you in terms of your mind, or at least we hope so. That's kind of the fun of it. The idea is that we are going to give you a prompt, and this will be a generic prompt. So imagine that movie trailer, in a world where blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we're going to give you a prompt kind of like that. Okay, but then it's going to be generic enough that the setting is really up to you. So this is not going to be the prompt, but imagine it's like, in a world where a woman is feels like she doesn't belong, she discovers a secret about her past that unlocks the future or something. I mean, that's terrible, but I'm just making up the fly. Our prompt is going to be better than that. But that kind of thing, right? And then you could say, oh, well, what could the secret be? And what could the world be? And how might it affect it? And things like that. And we'll give you little twists and stuff like that. Think kind of what you call it. Think kind of destination unknown. Okay. So So it'll be fun. Expect a lot of twists. We're really trying to get into that high level conceptual world building idea. I'm sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. I apologize. Yes, it sounds like a lot of fun. I'm really excited for it. I love world building. And yeah, I love And it could be anything. And don't and some of you might be like, yeah, well, I don't really write fantasy or sci-fi. It doesn't matter. There's always world building. There's world building even in a romance novel because it is simply the world that your story takes place. And even if it's quite similar to the world we know now, well, there is something about it that makes it distinctive, right? Is it a kind of an interesting location or things like that? Is the specific dynamics of the conflict of the character because of their family dynamics interesting or things like that? There's lots of different ways you can look at world building. So please don't discount yourself just because you do not write in some sort of highfalutin genre, as it were. It really does apply to any author. Whenever you write, you are essentially writing and you are world building. You are deciding what to include in the world you are talking about. I mean, this is even true for literary fiction that's realistic. You are choosing how to convey the world. And often those choices matter a lot. It is going to be on YouTube like this, the world building challenge. Yeah, it's going to be a whole contest. We're even going to have prizes and things like that. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. So I am super excited about it. Please, if you have not, subscribe, hit the bell for this channel. It helps us with the algorithm. To be honest, it helps other people find us, and it helps us continue to deliver great content. And speaking of great content, if you have any ideas for anything you'd like to see on this channel, please let us know. I know we have gotten some suggestions in the past that we certainly have done. We've gotten suggestions for a world building challenge before. So for those of you who asked, here we are. We're doing a world building challenge, and I'm really excited. So I will join you back next week for that. Oh, and 2 weeks from now, I'll go ahead and tease that. We do have RJ Barker, the brilliant fantasy author who's super creative with world building, like crazy good. And it'll be lots of fun with that. And if you're in the AutoCrit community, we're going to open up some opportunities for you to submit some questions. Obviously, you can come on live too and to do that, but we'll let our pro members kind of get jump the line a little bit and put in some questions as well because great resource. RJ Barker, it's great and a lot of fun. A lot of fun. Oh, good. I like you like highfalutin. My Danielisms. Building a book equals building a world. It is. Ways to start a sentence. That is something I think you suggested before, right? I remember hearing about sentence starters before. It is on my radar. Won't be for a bit. I think December timeframe might make sense. We'll see. We have different themes for the month, so a session on book premises that work and those that don't, please. That is a great idea. I love it. What we often call like the smell test, right? Is there a way that you can really easily see before you spend a whole lot of work if something's going to work or not? And the answer is kind of. So we can discuss what are some of those ways that you can avoid a lot of wasted effort. So yes, that sounds like a lot of fun. I've actually been building up some material based on that exact concept. So I love that. A session on fight scenes would be great. I might have to do either a lot more research in it or pull in a special guest for that because I'm not somebody who has done a lot of that. So that would be fun. A couple of months ago, you said there was a big change coming, and yes, it's still coming. We have been dealing with a lot of behind the scenes technical matters when it comes to it. And I know, there's been whispering and rumoring, and partly that's because we've been talking about it because we're so excited. It's getting closer. I'm sorry that it's a longer process than we might have anticipated. We really did hopefully have it ready by now, but it is still coming. It has not been shelved, and I really do think you'll think it's worth the wait once it comes. So, sorry to kind of what you call it, kind of leave you in a holding pattern for that, but it is close. It is imminent. Yes, great, fantastic. I can't give you more details than that because, to be honest, I'm not on the technical team, so I don't know the specific details. Technology always does. It does, and when you see it, you'll understand. Trust me. We just showed it around somebody, and they were like, "Wow, what do you're doing that much?" And we're like, "Yep." And they're like, "Oh, no wonder." I'm like, "Uh huh." So yeah, it's one of those things that it is going to be so much fun when it actually works. Somebody asked, have we done a writing a super book blurb for the back cover? Um, I don't know if we've done blurb. We have done a synopsis, which is not the same thing, and I'm not sure if we have. Certainly, search our channel to see if we have. I was not on one like that. Of course, somebody's gonna be like, "Yes, you were." I can forget. I do these every week. I don't recall us doing one specifically about blurbs. So, if we have not, I'll double check as soon as this is over, and I'll verify that. If we have not, I'll put that on the docket as well. Ah, thank you so much. Yes, I have a lot of fun with that for sure. I love button-down shirts, and I get a little bit bored with typical Hawaiian prints, so I make my own. All right. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me. As you can tell, I love being able to talk about writing and yes, Blur's best written by some of you. I love talking about writing and getting together with the community. Oh, query letters we've done. I keep wanting to leave it to keep giving you great comments. We've done query letters. Look for it on our channel. It is great. Yeah. Um, you would love a challenge on query letter writing. We might do something like that, like a workshop or something. Anyway, I just need to, you guys are going to let me go. But we'll see you next week for the world building challenge. And I am so excited about it. And I look forward to seeing you all there. In the meantime, like, subscribe, hit the bell, all that fun stuff. And I'll see you around the community. Bye, everybody.